Now, I'm going to try and speak for about 30 minutes. Unfortunately, today I've been losing my voice. So rather ironically, I'm going to be trying to talk to you about sound in the series while losing my voice and perhaps ending up miming out the last few points that I'd like to say. I'm just going to see if I can turn the lights down a little bit. Right. Okay, so first of all, thank you for coming. What I'm going to be presenting this evening is really a talk that many other scientists could also give about their own interactions with what's a truly remarkable television series that's just recently been broadcast in the UK, that's now being broadcast around the world at the moment. The American audience have just had the coral reef episode, so they're getting ready for going off into the big blue next week. And it's really been phenomenal just to see how much globally the series has been taken up. I'll speak for about half an hour, tell you a bit about my involvement in the series and the science that we do here in Exeter, but then I really would be very keen to have questions from you, comments from you, any ideas. Certainly when we talk from a university to a public audience, we're not only talking, we're listening as well. Some of the best science ideas I've ever had have come from random people that I've spoken to on a train or in an aeroplane or in a pub. So please do feel free to give ideas as well as ask questions. Okay, so over the last 5 years or so, I've been involved in the series in a number of ways. I'm lucky enough to know two of the producers from the series well. And as a result, 4 years ago was, with the Coral Reef episode as an example, taken on a fishing trip down to Polzeath, where me and the producer of that episode said, right, we're going to do a Coral Reef episode. What can we do that's going to be different? What could we do that's going to be really exciting or bring the public understanding of coral reefs to a different, new level? And so we sat down and we started to map out what the really cutting edge science was in coral reef ecology, what some of the new discoveries in coral reef behavior were, but also from his perspective, thinking about what cameras can do now that particularly they couldn't do. They couldn't shake off the fact that they were developing a series under the shadow of Blue Planet 1. So I don't know how many of you have seen Blue Planet 1. I know some of you were certainly not born when Blue Planet 1 came out. But it was at the time a groundbreaking series. It really immersed the public in the underwater world in a way they'd never really experienced it before. And so they were living under that pressure of trying to do something as good as Blue Planet 1. But because technology has moved on a long way, they were trying to think of new ways of making the marine environment come to life. As the series went on, obviously the film crews went off around the world, brought back footage. Some of the footage we knew exactly what was going on. Some of it we had no idea. So we'd then have to spend some time with the researchers trying to understand the behavior that we were seeing in this footage and trying to develop a narrative that brought, with all the scientific rigor, still an entertaining and engaging and sometimes very emotive narrative to the series. And then as we got close to the series, it was still being cut about October last year, September. There were still iterations of the program still being tinkered with. And we'd go back in and we'd watch it and we'd work out whether we felt the story was being presented in the right way and the balance of the episode worked. And meanwhile, of course, the narrative was being laid down with David Attenborough's wonderful, wonderful narration, which was also something that the researchers had, and with the scientific advisors on the series, to get that narrative really ringing true with the scientific community, as well as potentially with the hundreds of millions of viewers. So it was an amazing journey, and I was one of, I think they reckon that over 1,000 people worked on the series altogether. It goes to show what an enormous machine Blue Planet 2 was, to be able to deliver what are 7 remarkable films. And so really the exciting part of it from a marine biologist perspective was trying to understand and describe some of these incredible behaviors that were being brought back. So now can I just check, how many of you have seen Blue Planet 2? Almost all of you, okay. So if I refer to some of the characters and stories, hopefully they'll make sense to you. So you'll know about the trevallies catching the fledgling terns in mid-air, in mid-flight. This was, at the time, was a fisherman's anecdote. And the Blue Planet 2 crew, who obviously had a limited budget, had to think, so based on a fisherman's story, is it worth us sending a crew off to try and film this? But sure enough, as they went off and they interacted with some of the local fishermen, realized that they knew how to identify particular trevally that were likely to be hunting, particular birds that looked vulnerable. They managed to capture this really very new behavior. We also worked in some of the really classic marine biology centers of the world, one of them being the Great Barrier Reef. And there's an island called Lizard Island. I've spent about 1.5 years of my life there over the years, where researchers come from all over the world, share their ideas, share their techniques, and push what we think are the boundaries of our understanding of coral reef ecology. And yet, under our noses, as we do our experiments year in, year out, there are behaviors that are being uncovered that we still are completely surprised by, completely overwhelmed that things have been happening and we've not been noticing them. That's in many ways largely due to a very remarkable young guy, a guy called Alex Vale, who is the son of the directors of Lizard Island Research Station. So he's grown up on the island. And he hasn't had to fly out, try and deliver a piece of science and fly off again. He's been able to live there and grown up swimming out on the reefs, taking boats out, exploring the reef, and has found behaviors that really have shocked us all. So one of them that we had in the series was this interaction between the grouper and the octopus, we might want to talk about a bit later, where you've got two very different animals that have learned how to communicate with each other and then how to go hunting together. And by doing this, you've got an octopus that can flush fish out of holes, and you've got a grouper that can chase fish in. And that combination of confusion and attack means that both of them benefit in that hunting interaction. There's also, of course, Percy, the famous tuskfish, who is, again, a fish that has been presumably doing this under our noses for many years, based on the number of shells that it's got piled up around its coral anvil. But it's a fish that's learned how to go and collect clams, bring them back to a particular piece of coral, and then hold the clam in a particular way and smash its head on a rock to break open that clam, which again is a cognitive process, including the use of tools, which we probably didn't attribute, particularly in Blue Planet 1, to fish. We might think that whales, dolphins might be able to do these very higher cognitive, clever behaviors, but we didn't think that fish could, or certainly not an octopus, which is a kind of mollusk. Now, I don't know if any of you have been able to go to bed safe in the knowledge that you're not going to have a bobbit worm was clearly one of those rogue characters in Blue Planet 2, which certainly scared us all. I still jump when I watch that final part of the sequence. But it also scared the camera crews, to be fair to them. This is a worm not much shorter than the length of the table, which lives completely submerged in the sand, and it hunts at night. But if you go down with cameras and try and film it at night, it disappears into its hole. So they had to go and they had to film the whole thing in infrared, so with these different types of illumination. So the divers were in complete darkness with all of the camera gear, hoping that they were capturing this behavior of the bobbit worm. So we've already had some really interesting conversations earlier on about the Mobidae wrasse, which is a wrasse species, like many fish, that changes sex from, in this case, female to male during its life. And you just imagine, I mean, we all, those of us who are past adolescence, know what a roller coaster it can be in terms of hormones and confusion about life. Imagine then having to do that where your head starts to expand and your chin starts to expand and you start to feel a little bit like a fight, and you go off to try and claim a territory. In the case of that part of the film, it was claiming a shipwreck. And obviously, as well as trying to interpret and understand all the behavior, the challenge was then, and there's really only one man on this planet who could have done it with such effect, turn it into a narrative that is deeply engaging, full of information, but also very entertaining in a way that the viewers wanted to learn more and wanted to hear more. And so obviously it was a real privilege for the series to have David Attenborough really, honestly, probably he felt 5 years younger than the previous series that he'd been involved in, because because of the passion that he put into deeply excited by it, did a lot of beautiful pieces talking to the cameras, and so really added to Blue Planet 2 in a way that I think our generation are very, very lucky to have David Attenborough having done that. Now, one of the things that the Blue Planet 2 series wanted to do was to really add an acoustic element to the series that wasn't in Blue Planet 1. One of the criticisms of Blue Planet 1 was that most of the sound effects were made by Fred and George in a broom cupboard at the BBC studios with teaspoons and buckets of water and things. But technology has moved on, and so it's possible to take better underwater recordings. And so here, just as a tester, does anyone know what this is? And that's because you've got the sound of shipping all around the whale. So human noise became a real problem as we tried to bring the natural soundscapes of the series into each episode. And so the producers came to me and they said, look, you know, we want to bring more sound in. How can we do that? And I said, we've got some challenges because we're struggling as scientists to really understand what natural acoustics in the ocean are like. Because we know now through the research that we're doing here in Exeter that ships have a real effect. Underwater sonar, pile driving, construction noise underwater, the noise of motorboats, the noise of jet skis, all of these sounds are starting to swamp and to create an acoustic fog over what was originally the natural acoustic world. Now, I just want to explain why I'm interested in that. And it goes back to a lecture that I had as an undergraduate. Are any undergraduates in here? Yeah, a few undergraduates. Okay, great. So I was once sat in a lecture theatre one day, and the lecturer introduced me to the life cycle of fish in a way that I'd never really heard it before. I'd spent all of my teenage years fishing. I was obsessed with fishing, really interested in fish, but I'd never really thought about the life cycle, particularly in coral reefs. So the Blue Planet 2 series does a great job of showing you the adults swimming around on reefs, interacting with each other. But these fish, like the cobodai wrasse, at certain times in the year produce eggs, and those eggs then hatch and develop. But they don't develop on the reef. They develop right out at sea in blue water. And these fish go from being a very small, newly hatched fish into a larger larva. So it develops its eyes, its sense of smell, its stomach, its ability to feed, its swimming ability, its fins grow. And this fish goes from being a very newly hatched larva through to being a juvenile fish ready to live on a coral reef. So they're ready for life. They join the community on the coral reef, and then they develop from larvae through to adults. That's the life cycle of fish on coral reefs. And it's a bit like, have you learned about life cycles of things like butterflies? So you know about, or frogs and frog spawn and things. So you've got quite different parts of the life of animals, haven't you? And the same's true of coral reef fish, same's true of mussels, same's true of barnacles, crabs, all the fish that you would find on the coasts around England. And I was fascinated in this, particularly because there was a big unknown in this life cycle, which was at the point that the fish are ready to settle onto coral reefs, they might have been washed by the currents tens or hundreds of kilometers offshore. How on earth do they find their way back? And there was evidence just at the time that I was starting to think about it. Some fish even find their way back to the reef they'd started on, their natal reef, the reef their parents lived on. So it really begged the question, how on earth could they do that? And instinctively, we thought, well, it's got to be the sense of smell, or it's got to be the sense of they can see the reef, because it certainly couldn't be sound. And that's partly due to one guy who did some remarkable, amazing things for understanding and eventually for conserving the ocean, but who got one thing very wrong. And that's Jacques Cousteau, who was a very famous underwater explorer, one of the real first underwater filmmakers, who developed a feature film 62 years ago now, called Le Monde de Silence, The Silent World, where he presented into people's living rooms the underwater world. Now, unfortunately for Jacques Cousteau, that couldn't be further from the truth, but to give him credit, poor Jacques Cousteau spent most of his time lugging around chainmail that he had to dive in because he was worried about sharks. He was wearing breathing apparatus that he had scrounged from fire stations and modified. He invented the underwater aqualung. And as a result, whenever he went into the water, it sounded like he was diving with Darth Vader on his shoulder. And he often used underwater scooters. So you can forgive him for thinking that the world was silent down there, because really all he could hear was his own activity of exploring these new and exciting environments. But as I started to think about the life cycle of fish, I started to think, because I spent time working in different coral reef environments around the world, if I went snorkeling, I could really hear the underwater world in a different way. And so I started to read a little bit more and think a bit more. This was me at the time. I was also interested in whether we could catch baby fish, partly because it would be great for aquaculture, and it would be great for the aquarium trade, but also it would be really valuable for developing countries to be able to know how many fish are arriving each year so they can manage their fishery so they don't overfish, overharvest. So we were building equipment out of junk and swimming around on reefs, sometimes living in hammocks on beaches. And Di will know this place. This is Belize, which was an amazing opportunity where I spent 3 months starting to really think through some of these ideas and being able to spend each day out on the reef. I started reading physics textbooks, which was something that as an A-level student I'd done as a necessity, but they suddenly had a new meaning. And this is an amazing experiment in Lake Geneva, where there's one guy, so we've got one guy on the left who has a gun and a bell underwater, and he both hits the bell and fires the gun at the same time. And then we've got his friend in a boat. I don't know how many friends he got through, but he's trying not to be shot while listening underwater to hear when the bell sound arrives compared to where the gun sound arrives. What he realized was that sound travels about 5 times as fast underwater. And at the time that I was doing more reading, there was a lot of information being declassified by the military, which was starting, so this was from Second World War recordings, starting to show with microphones that had been dropped from aeroplanes that the ocean was in fact very noisy. To them, the biological noise was a problem because it was muffling the sounds of submarines and torpedoes. But to us as biologists, it was hugely exciting. So we know through a range of different experiments that we run, and we've heard the humpback whale already, that animals use sound to communicate. And some of these are sounds that build the tapestry of the soundscape on a coral reef. So here we've got whales, dolphins, we've got fish that vocalize, we've got different types of invertebrates that create noise. And these are all sounds that we wanted to try and bring into Blue Planet 2 so that the viewer would experience and feel that acoustic element to the marine world. So if I play a recording of a coral reef where you've got all of these animals making this noise, this is what it sounds like. Here that the coral reef is really a very diverse and rich acoustic environment. And what we've realized with our research is that actually if we play back recordings of coral reefs, we can call fish to settle into artificial reefs. So we realize that that sound is one of the key cues they use to find their way home. Now we've also spent some time interacting with the media. The first opportunity that we really had to do this was with David Attenborough's Great Barrier Reef series. Did anyone see that series? Okay, so David Attenborough was lucky to spend about 2 months traveling around on the Great Barrier Reef on the Aleutian, the big ship that had the helicopter and the submarines in Blue Planet 2. And he made his own 3-part TV series about the Great Barrier Reef. So we had a day where, first of all, he arrived on the island and he said, so where's Simpson then? And I kind of put my hand up. He said, I've been given this script by the production company. To be honest, I don't think very much of it. And I'd spent about 6 months writing that script with his production company. Denied all knowledge, don't worry, David, we'll sit under a tree and we'll have lunch. So we sat, in fact, not under a tree because it was a coconut tree. Never sit underneath a coconut tree, okay? Sit next to the coconut tree. Sat next to a coconut tree and we rewrote the script. And that was where I realized just the level of rigor that he has, because he'd say, right, what do we need to say? So I said, well, you want to say that coral reefs are very noisy places. Coral reefs are remarkably noisy places. How do you know that? And so we'd then go through this iterative process. Every line had to have the science to back it up. So it was a really exciting interaction. He then went out on a boat and we were swimming around with our hydrophones playing our recordings, playing real coral reef noise in the case of this series for David Attenborough. And he had this amazing interest in everything that was going on. So although he was, at the time he was 87 and he would kind of walk around on the beach, there'd be someone following him with a deck chair in case he wanted to sit down. Anytime a camera it was his turn, he just jumped into this life and he went back to being a 17-year-old who just discovered the most exciting thing on the planet. Amazing person. So we did this for a day and he put together a sequence on underwater noise and how fish find their way home. And then we stopped to take some selfies and we thought the night was over, and then someone said, hang on a minute, we've got to do the last bit, which is where David Attenborough is peering into a light trap and there's a bit of faint glow on the horizon. And obviously the sun goes down very fast. So I realized the only way that I was going to get him there, because it was 1.5 kilometers up the beach, was to bundle him into this old dune buggy, which I started with a screwdriver, got him into the dune buggy. He had my dive torch because it had no headlights, and we made our way off over the dunes. And I said to him, look, we've not met before, and I'm really deeply embarrassed that this is the situation that we're now in after your 2 months on the Aleutian. I'm really very sorry. And he looked at me and he said, this is more like it. And he was clearly so pleased to be back into that real adventuring world, which was magical. So he made that part of the film. So we've really, through our research, taken recordings all around the world now. Some of the research vessels that we've had the funding to be able to afford have been obviously on a par with the Aleutian. This was my first that I used in Oman, that I was able to dangle a hydrophone underneath and sail over coral reefs so that I wasn't interacting with the animals, wasn't scaring the animals away. I then realized it was easier to swim out and sit in my rubber ring and take recordings, or eventually, if we wanted to take long-term recordings, we used the hydrosaur, which was this inflatable dinosaur that we could leave our gear out at sea and take our recordings. So we've taken these recordings and we've also coupled all of the recordings with underwater surveys of habitat and fish. And obviously, as we've gone on, our equipment has evolved, so we now can listen in many directions at the same time. We can tease apart which animals are making which sounds. And we've realized that reefs have signature sounds, that reef noise indicates the habitat and the fish community that you've found there, because they're the ones making the noise. So if you are this little fish and you want to go and find somewhere to live, it's a bit like if you were moving to a new city, you'd Google the different neighborhoods to see which one you fancied. Fish can listen from distance without having to go and try and escape all of the predators that are hoping to gobble them up, and choose the community they want to go and join using sound. And we know that they can do this to select microhabitat. Research that you might find making its way into the media over the next year or so has then been focusing, particularly with one of my PhD students, Tim Gordon, on the way that the coral bleaching that you saw in the coral reef episode and in the final episode has been modifying the soundscape. And so that's something to keep an eye out for. But we've realized that we can use acoustics to take the health of an environment, as well as simply to understand who's there. We can work out whether it's improving or degrading. And if it's degrading, we can work out what to do about it. So through a number of conversations, we realized with episode 7 that the BBC were going to be doing something very bold, very brave in the main series, putting a film out which was really focusing on big issues in the marine environment, and focusing not just on those issues, but also highlighting the kinds of people that are involved in working on those and the potential solutions. So it's a real departure for the BBC Natural History Unit to put a film like that into the main series. And all credit to them, because I think what they saw with the viewing figures was that actually people care. People aren't just simply wanting to turn on a Sunday night and be entertained by clever animals or colourful animals or big predators. They really do have a deep passion for the ocean or for any environment and want to know what they can do about it. So they said, wouldn't it be great if we could actually put a small bit of film together that considers underwater noise into that final episode? So I said, well, that's a great idea. I've actually got a project down in Dorset at the moment where we're looking at the impact of pile driving noise on nesting sea bream. And if you get the conditions just right, you can see them, and you can actually, from about 2 or 3 meters away, you could probably film where they live. And they looked at me and they said, yeah, it's not really going to make great television, that. I said, no, it's okay. Like, you get just a few days each year where it's beautiful. They said, yeah, we need something a little bit more predictable. So why don't we go to Malaysian Borneo? To which I said, okay, that's a really nice idea. I'll go with that. So obviously the Blue Planet 2 really covers every different ecosystem in the world in remarkable color and brings the diversity of the marine environment to us all. So we went to Malaysia and Borneo, but they said, we'll pick you up in a van and it'll take you to Heathrow and then we'll get you off to Malaysia and Borneo. And it was a very big van that turned up with blackened windows. I thought, this is interesting. Maybe the whole crew are in here. But I then jumped in the front and there was just me and the driver. So we got to Heathrow and they said, and I pulled out my rucksack and I had my dive gear. And they said, just one minute. So I was like, okay, yeah. And they said, right, we've got a bit more kit that we'd like you to take with us. So eventually, I managed to check in with 33 additional bags. And it really just is an amazing insight into both the logistical operation of creating Blue Planet 2, the innovation, because many of the things in these flight cases are completely new. They've been built by companies around the world, in some cases by amateur cameramen in their garage in Bristol. But it's lots of people throwing new ideas together. And then there's all the train tracks that the cameras move on underwater. The batteries, obviously, are lithium batteries, so you can't put them in the hold. So they then said, so could you just take this pull along with all the batteries? Turned out to be 77 kilograms of batteries. Anyway, eventually we got out to Malaysian Borneo. And the equipment that we were trialing was this multi-directional hydrophone array that can listen in 4 different directions at the same time. And by putting those recordings together, we can start to work out where different sounds are coming from. And when you're at home and you're listening to it, you're starting to develop a stereo or even surround sound feel of the ocean. And that was really exciting to be able to engage with the sound crews and use equipment that we certainly hadn't been using in our research before. But we now have PhD students and master's students who are using similar approaches around the world. Now, they said we want a charismatic character involved in the film. So they introduced me in Malaysian Borneo, a place called Marbul, near to Sipadan, to their clownfish, the famous clownfish that used, what did they use to lay their eggs on? Yeah. Coconut shell, well done. So they tried, can you remember they tried a hermit crab? And that was a really bad idea because it walked off. And then they tried a water bottle and that floated off, didn't it? And eventually they found that a coconut shell was just the right weight for them to be able to build and lay their eggs on. So they introduced me to these clownfish, and I was particularly interested in getting them communicating with each other in a way that we could try and interpret some of the sounds that they made. And so they said, okay, we'll all swim down, and obviously in front of me, so behind the anemone, you've got the cameraman, and you've got the tripod, and you've got the camera, and that's then on a big train track, and you've got the director, and you've got often the producer, you've got a buddy diver, so you've got a whole bunch of people in the water, all crowding around these little clownfish. And you can imagine as a little clownfish that you're not going to be on your best behavior when you're interacting with all of those people. So they said, what are we going to do about that? I said, well, I've got an idea. It's a trick that I've got up my sleeve, and I know that you've got hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of equipment, but I've got a puppet fish. And so I produced Boris from my bag one evening, And they all started laughing at me and said, what on earth are you going to do with that? And I pulled out a broom handle and showed how I could wire it up, and decided that now was the time for the first ever underwater puppetry. And so the next day we went off to Sipadan Island, and I started swimming around with Boris on my broom handle. And obviously I was slightly nervous that this might not work, but I've still got all the camera crews. And we're swimming along, and I'm thinking, this is a plastic fish on a stick, isn't it? And they're all filming it and so on. And then a damselfish came out. Damselfish are really territorial, and they defend a little patch of seaweed, algae that they farm. And this damselfish came out and started like making a popping noise at the grouper, at Boris, and then went back again. I thought, well, that was kind of quite a realistic interaction. That's good. And then we went along a bit further, and a turtle came over and looked at it. And, you know, turtles think fairly slowly and move fairly slowly. Checked him out, gave a little shrug of its shoulder, which I'm sure was at me, and then swam off again. And I thought, well, that wasn't too strange. So then we carried on swimming along, and another grouper came out and swam alongside it. Now, I don't know if Boris is a boy or a girl, but this grouper was fairly convinced that Boris was hot property and started changing colour, which fish often do when they want to try and impress each other. So I've now got, as well as the camera crew and the producer and everybody, Boris on a stick, me on scuba, and this signalling grouper swimming alongside. So I'm thinking, well, I've got to go along with this. I've got to now try and be slightly flirtatious with Boris as we're swimming along, knowing that what I'm doing is actually being filmed in a way that hundreds of millions of people will see just how low my career has sunk, that I spend my spare time trying to impress fish with other fish. But luckily for us, Boris was really effective as he came to the anemone in getting our clownfish talking. And because, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of our research has focused on underwater noise as being a problem, we were keen that the final part of that story also considered underwater noise. So for those of you that haven't seen the final episode, or those of you that saw it before Christmas, just to remind you how all of that science that I've just told you about, 20 years of science, ended up being condensed down into about 5 minutes or so. This is what we ended up with. I think what that does, hopefully, is condense in a way that only David Attenborough's narration can do. A huge amount of information into something that is very engaging and hopefully has sparked the interest in many people in wanting to know more about underwater noise. And that's really something that the whole series has done, in that while the BBC haven't gone out to try and campaign about the ocean, they haven't needed to. I think the really profound thing about the series is that we're engrossed in it because it's an alien environment. When we watch Blue Planet 2, we're being taken to worlds we'll never visit, being taken to see things that we've never seen before, and to encounter animals that to us are just beyond our imagination. And yet in every episode, it's really clear that there are also human impacts. The footprint of humanity is in the deepest ocean, is in the Arctic, is in Antarctica, is on coral reefs, is in our temperate waters. And the public interest in the series has led now to things really starting to change. For those of you that haven't seen the Blue Planet 2 website, there's a tab called Help Our Oceans, which I really encourage you to have a look at, that gives a whole range of different suggestions as to ways that you might want to get involved. Decisions you can make about what you buy and which fish are sustainable and what the best energy supplier would be, and how you might be able to get involved in beach cleans around the country, and so on. So I really encourage you to look at that. The personal response to Blue Planet has been the most exciting thing to me. But what's also been exciting is how much at the top, if you would like to call government the top, how much the people who make decisions that govern our country or to govern other countries around the world are also being influenced by their experience of watching Blue Planet 2. So in debates in Parliament, we often hear Blue Planet 2 being referred to. such that there is now consultations on single-use plastics. There are suggestions that we'll now be moving to different types of recycling strategies and so on. And so two of those headlines just very recently are that Glasgow has banned plastic straws. I was in India over Christmas, where now that every coconut stall has a no plastic straw poster up, and they have metal straws that they can use to drink from coconuts. So the solutions are simple if there are enough people who are interested in employing those. And just today in the news was this idea that we might move to a loan and return bottle scheme so that we can recycle bottles in a way that at the moment we don't do. So hopefully Blue Planet 2 will be a series that captures the imagination of everybody and brings about real changes that will improve the quality of the ocean and the way that we interact with the planet. So you heard a couple of these key facts earlier. It's a series with 125 expeditions to 39 countries, 6,000 hours of filming, 5 of the 10 most watched programs, watched by over 100 million people. Each week it slowed the internet in China as people watched it. And that's where the viewers are. So rightly so, David Attenborough and the Blue Planet 2 crew were awarded the Special Impact Award in the TV Awards. And I just want to finish with David Attenborough's quote from the last sequence in the last episode, where he says, "We're at a unique stage in our history. Never before have we had such an awareness of what we are doing to the planet, and never before have we had the power to do something about that. Surely we have a responsibility to care for our blue planet. The future of humanity, and indeed all life on Earth, now depends on us." So hopefully all of you will take your experiences of watching Blue Planet and hope that maybe Blue Planet 3 is a film that's made the next generation. You'll be the ones out there filming and chasing the fish. And that will be a series that talks about the recovery of the world's oceans.